Hello and welcome to the dark side. We are happy that you're joining us. Obviously, today someone is wearing a very red shirt with a very distinct symbol on it of joy. You could barely contain your smile. It's hilarious. Congratulations, Liverpool. They won the League Cup. Well done. Happy household over here.
Yeah, do you know what? I'm actually conflicted. I want to be happy, and then you look at the events that are going on just over there, and yeah, it's quite surreal to know what's going on so close to you, and then just see life going on around you as normal. So it's dealing with that feeling of surrealness. I'm not sure what the word is. And then also Liverpool, so it's
It's finding the joy. I think there's a very deep theological point happening there, which is that in a life of pain and suffering, we are still given the option and the blessing to find joy and to find peace. And so it's finding the joy within that. And for you, the joy is very evident because your team won the cup. They look like they fought hard, though. That looked like an actual hard-fought match. Like, it went full time, extra time, penalties. I mean, you went down to the wire. What was this, like the last penalty, and you finally won?
Yeah, the keepers. Well, not the last penalty. They would have had to start again. So, but
the keepers did the job.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. Now that we have that out of the way, we will get on with the news for today. So obviously we've already put in the bio that we're going to be dealing with something very heavy, but there is still other news happening, and I wanted just to bring your attention to a few things. One of which is that the ex-police officers, as they're described, are found guilty in the case of the murder of George Floyd. So it's 3 ex-Minneapolis policemen that were present at the death, not the ones that held their knee, of course, but the ones who held off the public from giving him help. So that's Toy Tao, J. Alexander Kung, and Thomas Lane. While they all testified in their own defense, they were found guilty this week and will now be going to trial, full trial for what is the officer charged with showing deliberate indifference to serious medical needs during the arrest in 2020. They are being charged with violating a person's civil rights, and that carries a sentence of 25 years. So as the anniversary is approaching, I think that's good news for the family. It's good news for everyone who protested. It's good news that this is actually going forward. It took a 12-person jury 13 hours to deliberate and come back with a guilty verdict. So they are now being prosecuted through the federal level, which is good news.
Yes, it is good news. I do have some thoughts about it, and I do have some sympathies for 2 of the officers. One of them had been on the job for 3 days, and the other one for 4 days.
Yes, this did come out in the trial.
And so there's a real power imbalance. What you have to understand is, and a lot of people say, going into the police force is like going into a gang.
Mm.
And so
Mhm.
having the courage to speak out against someone higher up than you that you know will have consequences for you can be quite worrying.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think, yes, they are guilty, but I think in the sentencing, leniency should be shown towards that factor. And I think also what it does is highlight uh, real failings in the training of the
Yeah.
police, where one, they're not equipped to challenge wrongdoing when they see
Mhm. Mhm.
it, and that they themselves don't feel empowered
Mm.
to do anything.
Yeah.
And there was a video going around recently of this female officer who dragged her sergeant off of someone who was handcuffed in the back of a
Mhm.
car,
Mhm.
and she is the one that the police federation are going after, right? Although the sergeant was gonna harm the thing, in the state that she was in, there's a law that says you have to intervene if you see something wrong. So she's actually abiding by the law.
Yeah.
And as a result, the sergeant then grabbed her by the throat and had her by the throat. And she is the one who the police are coming after, right? So there's a real failing in the training, but also it shows the problems, the systemic problems within the
Systemic
police
problems. Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
So yes, I do believe they are guilty because at some point your humanity has to kick in when you see what's happening. Your humanity should kick in, but also at the same time, I do see the that there are factors for two of the officers at least in this, So yeah.
Very difficult. But as I say, it's good that these things are now at least going to trial and people are assessing them in what seems to be a more realistic fashion than they were previous. So that's at least a good news. This is a very random story, actually. So there have been 4 people in the Netherlands. This is our second story. 4 people in the Netherlands have been poisoned with a spiked Moët and Chandon champagne. They had, for some reason, there was MDMA in the champagne. It has hit across Germany and the Netherlands. One person has actually died as a result of this spike in MDMA. MDMA is a very serious drug, as those of you that know anything about that world will know that's very serious and it can be extremely dangerous, according to the content. And so they actually don't know what's been causing it, and they have been withdrawing the serial numbers that are related to the case. But that is to say that there is still, the reason I put it in today, because I was like, what do you mean? People are just spiking drinks, like, and bottles, like you open the bottle and it's the bottle itself was spiked with this product. Now they question whether it was legally acquired, so maybe it came off of the dark market or something like that. I don't know, but the bottle in Germany was actually opened in a restaurant, which would indicate something quite different. And it's difficult for the NVWA, which is the food standards body, the Dutch food standards body, to actually track down what is going on and why people are ending up in hospital. And obviously, someone has died as a result of this. So be careful out there, people. Be careful. There's still evil that would just randomly attack people like that.
Look, I mean, you're talking about spiking champagne with MDMA. We need to talk about that teacher that was spiking the cupcakes for them kids in that school.
I tried to give a European story today.
Okay.
I
Okay.
just I just tried to keep it this way. I
All
was
right.
like, no, the thing is, this last week I have found the sheer volume of wicked, evil kind of people present in the world news stories quite overwhelming. It's as if we had like a lull during the pandemic of actually hearing some of the worst cases, like they were happening once a week, and this week it looked like just everything was packed into one week, and I was like, did 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 we do something? Is there something wrong? And of course this week, bringing us to story number 3 with the Ukrainian crisis and the war that is happening there and the invasion. I mean, it just is really quite disturbing that we are living through a pandemic and people have not learned anything about loving their neighbor at all. Just nothing. Just didn't settle in. People are still going about their daily business and creating havoc and evil. So the third story will lead us in, I hope, into the main thing that we're going to talk about. And this was a piece done in the BBC. It was regarding the Ukraine crisis and Africa and the effects that it's having on oil, students, and bread. So it broke it down into a number of different parts. And it says the war in Ukraine could literally have devastating effects on different African nations. Now, the way that they phrased it is actually a little bit biased in the article, so I'm just correcting it as we go along, but you can look it up for yourself. But it's going to have it can have potentially devastating effects. So they talk about the fact that South Africa has come out very publicly and said, at the UN, no, they need to just come out of the people of them country, and just need to stop doing this. They need to pursue diplomatic conversations. What's interesting, of course, is that South Africa has investments in Russia to the tune of about 80 billion rand, and Russia has investments in South Africa to the tune of about 23 billion rand. So you're talking about an awful lot of money that's linking these two countries, and there's a lot of investment. So in some ways, you could argue that it's within South Africa's best interest to appease its financial ally, but instead it's coming out and making a stand. And the article then goes on to talk about the fact that Kenya, although not a permanent member on the Security Council, is on the Security Council and has spoken openly against Russia. Ghana, Gabon have come out and condemned it. Even Mali and the Central African Republic have also not supported Russia in this. And so there's this real sense that things are happening, but it has an effect. Russia has made a lot of investments within the African nations. So have other people. And we know that a lot of this is about political power and how you can sway votes on the UN Council if you invest in the right country. And so how does this affect the ordinary lives of people? Now, it was saying that basically oil prices have obviously surged beyond the $100 a barrel. And that may come up later, that we talk about this idea that oil is measured in dollars, but we're going to stick to this story right now. But what that means is that Nigeria, for example, could see they're an oil producing company, could see an increase in their profitability, which would help the nation overall. However, the price for the average person may not offset the profits that they're making from their oil. So of course that means that the average person really just suffers under the burden of these prices, and it's the oil producing companies that are making the companies, not the people that are actually doing this. So overall, is this going to be good for their economy? And there are questions over whether that trickle-on effect throughout the African nations is actually going to be really detrimental. The second thing that they talk about is the fact that the Ukraine is one of the biggest wheat producing countries. Wheat, is that right? Wheat?
Yeah.
Grain, that's the word I was looking for. And so, of course, for bread, and bread, of course, being a staple in many African nations, this actually poses problematic situations if that is now going to be cut off as a source of revenue. Up to 30% of the grain in certain African nations comes from the Ukraine, and therefore, can the rest of the countries actually pick up that offset? Will it be then driving up prices? Will that again drive a hunger situation within certain countries? These are all questions, and will that make economies generally disbalanced? Now, for Europeans, we've seen our inflation rising quite heavily, and we know the struggle of that burden. So we can empathize, I think, with when African nations are saying this conflict is going to directly affect us. We can see that correlation because it's happening to us, right? We can see it. No, apparently they don't see it. Anyway, another place that it affects, and this I didn't have a clue about until I was reading into this report, is that there are thousands of African nation students in the Ukraine. I had no clue. Now, a lot of them are calling on their countries to say that they feel abandoned because there are thousands, thousands. There are 8,000 from Morocco, 4,000 from Nigeria, 3,500 from Egypt. Ghana has 1,000, so on and so forth. Students who go to the Ukraine because of the historical ties with that country, and therefore, they tend to, and also they have a good medical program and other things. But what they're saying is, how are we getting our students out of the country? How are we going to safeguard them? Now, a lot of students are bunkered down, they're in hiding, they're not able to, of course, the cities are in war and the conflict is raging. And so student universities, we know, have become centers of refuge, and people are actually, they've turned into refuge centers so that people are taking refuge there because they can't go anywhere else. So there's all these questions about what's happening. And what strikes me is that overall, with all the misinformation that's out there, one thing that people aren't actually really understanding is the sheer size of the Ukraine, the sheer amount of output the Ukraine has, and maybe some of the underlying reasons that this is causing a huge conflict around the world, and has ripple-on effects beyond, of course, the most serious effect, the loss of life that is happening there, the loss of sovereignty, the loss of their ability to be their own country. They have already had a part of their country annexed, and now the country is being invaded, and the world is responding in very interesting ways to something that is very, very disturbing. So I'm turning it over to you because you're more knowledgeable on Eastern European politics than I am. But I hope I've given you a good foundation. As I say, this was taking it from a different angle, looking at the African angle and how for African nations, this is obviously very serious, that there is a war happening that threatens to catapult the whole world into a world war, of course. But underneath that, there are some other issues about the relationship that Russia has tried to cultivate with African nations and has tried to manipulate, and obviously how the UN Council works and how those votes work, how they're handing those pies is not by accident, shall we put it like that. It is the same colonial powers that we are used to seeing.
Yeah, I mean, just to touch on the angle that you mentioned regarding Africa, I mean, I was reading an article today about the events that have been happening in the past few days where the African students that you're speaking of and the people living there are still complaining that, or saying that racism has gotten worse since the invasion. So
Yeah.
you're being invaded, but you still got time to be racist towards black people. I mean, let's be real here. You need to sort your priorities out. It's not them that are invading you.
Wow.
Look, you know, that aside, all right. So I think we need to, as you mentioned, people aren't aware of the sheer size of the Ukraine. So the size of the Ukraine is that it is 233,062 square miles.
Mm-hmm.
So, for a source of comparison, the Netherlands is 12,900 square miles. So, we're talking about a country that's 20 times the size.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Or for those in the UK is 93,600 square miles. So, we're talking about a country that's 2.5 times the size of the UK. When I say the UK, I don't mean just Britain. I
No,
mean the
the
UK,
whole,
right? Including Northern Ireland in that.
Yeah.
So that should give you some example of the sheer size of this. And
Yeah.
we're talking about a country with 40 something million population.
42 million. 42 million.
Yeah, that's the estimate. The census they had in 2001 actually had it at 48.5 million.
Yeah, precisely.
But the estimate of the 41 million doesn't include the population in the annexed Crimea.
Yes, that's right. So they only say 42 million plus they have a part of stolen land. Of course, somebody has stolen a part of their country, and there is a whole population of people that are living under that oppressive system of having their land occupied.
Right. So, excuse me. Some information about the Ukraine. I think the historical context is necessary. After the Russian Revolution,
Mm.
which was 1917 to 1923, basically during the period of the First World War, was the Russian Revolution. The Ukrainian, the area of the Ukraine formed its own state. They formed a state. The People's something. It was basically a Soviet, as you had in Russia, and you had the collection of Soviets. And the Ukraine was one of the founding members of the USSR, one of the founding Soviets.
Okay.
And then you had the fall of the USSR, 1991, and then Ukraine regained its independence. At this point, it declared itself a neutral state.
Okay.
And that is important for many different reasons.
Okay.
Because of the international law, and this is a fascinating part of international law, a neutral state has certain rights. And you can declare yourself to be a neutral state in regards to a war, or just indefinitely, we are
okay.
a neutral state. And with that, your citizens should get extra rights. So where the African nations are having issues getting their students home, if they were neutral states, the soldiers should be allowing them out of the country, basically safe passage, not interfering with their passage.
Right. Okay.
And things like that. So there are, I said, some benefits for doing this. But as a neutral state, you cannot supply arms. You cannot help a belligerent party, or in other words, one of the parties at war. Right.
Okay, I see. Yes, the penny is beginning to drop as to what the problem is. Understand now. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So, you can't help if someone's at war. You're not supposed to, or as a government, you cannot sell them equipment.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
You cannot give military aid. You can't do any of these things. But that doesn't stop your private companies and citizens from doing so.
Right. Yes.
Right. You're not allowed to let armies travel through your lands or transport goods through your land, get there, and different things like that. You are allowed to let injured people, so soldiers who have been injured, are allowed to be transported in your land or come to your territory for medical treatment. But you have to ensure that they don't return to the war.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So you're meant to take steps to try and ensure that they don't actually return to battle. And I said there's all sorts of other different things that go along with it. It's a fascinating part of international law.
It is, and so Belgium and Luxembourg are neutral states, from what I've read on the Security Council. They have been.
Yes, but here's the thing. So a neutral state, or to be a neutral party, to declare yourself a neutral state, doesn't mean that you can't speak out. So you can voice an opinion on these things, but you just cannot get involved in these things.
Yeah. Because they're on the Security Council, as far as I understand, not as a permanent member, but they serve on the Security
rotating. Yeah, they rotate
members. Yeah.
So there become real issues with this. So Ukraine's a neutral state. Okay. So moving on from that, you then have the START Treaty, Strategic Armaments I can't remember what the R is for, but basically this is the treaty between Russia and US, and they're trying to get other countries on board. You had start one, now there's start two, in which they're trying to decrease the amount of nuclear weapons in the world.
Right. Okay. So there we've seen some of this before with other countries like Iran, so on and so forth, where they try to make these treaties in order to reduce the number of weapons. This doesn't always go well,
Yeah,
these
right?
conversations.
So what you had was after the fall of the USSR,
Hmm.
I think Ukraine had the second highest stockpile in the world of nuclear weapons.
Oh, really? Well, yeah, I guess so. They had the big nuclear part. Yeah. Ooh.
Well, what you
Okay.
have to remember is the
Yeah,
Ukraine is
cool.
something like the second or third largest resources of
Yeah,
plutonium.
yeah, yeah. No, and of course it had the nuclear plants. What's it called?
Yeah, Chernobyl, but
Chernobyl with the
that was
accident.
power,
Yeah, yeah.
allegedly, who knows? But
Mhm,
that was a power station. So,
mhm.
um, there was a real concerted effort to get these weapons off the table. So what you had come out of this is what was known as the Budapest Memorandum,
Okay.
in which uh, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and the Ukraine would give up their nuclear weapons, and in exchange, I believe the signatories to this were the US, the UK, and Russia, were to protect and assist the Ukraine in any if there was any aggression. They were to also respect the international boundaries as they were established at the time, and that they were not to interfere in the inner runnings of the country through sanctions and other means.
Okay, so I have like 101 questions now because I'm like, this a whole mess. No
Right.
wonder the world is about to go to war. This is a whole mess right here. I
Well,
mean, when you annex Crimea, how that gonna work? Like you can't, and of course, Putin is claiming, of course, the NATO issue is a problem for the Ukraine. Understandably, if they're supposed to be neutral, but you did the first blow by cutting a whole chunk of them off and saying it was Russia. I mean, there's some real that's a real mess right there.
well, I think we need to get into one of the real problems, or some of the real problems that come out of this. So, when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, 2012, 2014, I believe it was, um, the UK, France, the US, they all said, listen, Russia, you are breaking the Budapest Memorandum, the terms agreed in that. And Russia turns around and they say, no, we're not. Because what they said was the Budapest Memorandum was a political document, not a legal one.
That's what Russia said.
This is what Russia said, right? So their only obligation, I believe, they said the only obligation they had under the Budapest Memorandum was not to use nuclear weapons, I think it was. I think that was the only obligation they said they had under the Budapest Memorandum.
How do you sign
Now,
something that gives stipulations and then turn around and say it's not legal? Do I get to do that in my daily life?
but here's the problem. Here's the problem that Western nations have. Here's the problem that Western nations have. You can't take issue with Russia for that when the US holds the same approach towards the Budapest Memorandum. So the US regards the Budapest Memorandum as a political document and not a legally binding one.
How is this a thing?
This is why they are not getting involved and not, or
How
part of
is
the reason
this a
they're not
thing?
getting involved and not putting boots on the ground because they're arguing we don't have a legal obligation to do so.
I
So
feel like Can we call liar on this? Do we get to say liar? Do we get to, on behalf of the Ukrainian people, you lot lied.
right?
Like, you all are lying.
So you had these people give up their nuclear weapons, which was a deterrent.
Give up their
Said
defenses
we will,
effectively
yeah,
against
and say
countries that have nuclear weapons around them.
you say you give this up, and we will protect you. So not only did under this Budapest memorandum, you have to look at the feelings. Not only has the US and the UK failed to protect the Ukraine, right? But one of the signatories is the actual party that is invading them.
But that's what I'm saying. There's a problem from the time, because you said that one of the things was that they're not to interfere in the country's politics. You're not allowed to come in. So by you coming in, annexing a whole part, and now, of course, coming in and trying to take over the country, that whole move, right? You signed a document that said you shouldn't do that.
And here's another thing.
Thief, liar.
Russia has accused the US of breaking the Budapest memorandum first because the US had imposed sanctions on the Ukraine. Now, the US were arguing we imposed the sanctions on the Ukraine because they were violating human rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Whole different argument. Whatever. The point is,
let me get this straight. Equivalency. This is what we're going with. The equivalency. You put some sanctions to stop them breaking human rights laws, and you thought that gave you a right to just go in and take the people of them country.
But the reality is,
what on earth?
Listen, you can talk about equivalency all you want, but the reality is nobody has been upholding their part under these accords apart from Ukraine, who gave up their nuclear weapons.
My gosh, have mercy on me. Have mercy.
So you then have to look at what's happening over there and why the Ukrainian government and people feel so let down by Western nations.
Yeah.
Because you promised something, and down to it, you didn't keep your word.
We're fighting on our own. Where are our allies? That's literally what the man said. Where are our allies?
So,
Lordy, this is terrible.
You had, yeah. So, as I said, I'm just trying to give some historical context. You had in 2012, I think it is, the president, what's his name?
Is he the current president?
No.
Of which country?
Of Ukraine. Anyway, they had a president in the Ukraine, and the Ukraine was meant to enter into a treaty with the EU, and then he didn't sign it, and instead wanted to move closer towards Russia and sign an agreement with Russia.
Viktor Yanukovych.
Yeah, I believe that. Yep, that's the one. So there was then a protest, a lot of protests throughout the country, and it resulted in the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, I believe it was.
Yep.
And what happened with this is that I think there was an incident in which security police and protesters engaged, and 130 people were killed. Right? And including that number was something like 18 police officers. So out of this, what happened was Yanukovych agreed to early elections. And then the very next day after signing this agreement, he flees Kyiv.
He flees to Russia, right? He's actually hiding out in Russia to this day, is that?
Yeah. So he flees, and then their parliament, I can't remember what it's called now. I was going to say Duma, but that's the Russian one. The Ukrainian parliament then declares that Yanukovych is relieved of all his duties.
Mm-hmm.
Interim government comes in. Russia refuses to acknowledge the interim government. They hold elections, right? So then they hold elections, and Russia at the start said, "Yeah, well, we will respect the outcome of the elections."
Ain't not your
They
business.
they don't respect the outcome of the elections,
That ain't
and
not your business.
Yanukovych asks Russia for help and to intervene.
But he's been relieved of all his duty. He's not president of nothing. What you mean help to intervene? You can. Do I get to go to our president over there, our prime minister over there, and start asking him for help to intervene when I what? What do you mean? Oi oi oi, oi oi oi, oi oi oi.
Right. So
This has been a mess from the get-go, is what you're saying. Except for
absolutely,
the fact that Ukraine upheld their end of the bargain. This been a mess.
yeah.
This been a whole mess.
Right. Okay. So now protests break out in the southeastern part of the country, I believe it is. Protests break out. Russia backs some of the separatists.
Mhm.
Um, and then there were two states, Donetsk and another one beginning with L, that declare themselves independent states. And Russia goes, yeah, well, okay, we'll recognize you.
Hello, what now? But you don't have it's not your
So
business. You
you have
signed a
to understand,
document that told you it's not your business.
but you have to
Mind
understand,
your business.
right? So you have to understand. Now, this is Putin's take on this. Putin argues that he is not breaking the Budapest Memorandum because the Ukraine went through a revolution, and in this revolution, two new states were formed, and
Oh.
so
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
so they
Mm.
have no legal obligations in regards to these new states.
Now who's playing politics? Now who's
Right?
playing
Well,
politics? We
I'm
got
like
playing fast and loose.
very much so,
Fast and loose.
very very much so. Um, Now, here's the thing:
Sorry.
the rush, I'm going to have to look at my notes for what's going to happen because there's some interesting statistics, right?
Okay.
So the people that want to separate from the Ukraine,
Mhm.
or who want closer ties with Russia,
Right.
right?
Because there are those separatists within the Ukraine. Yes.
There are, and so just some statistics from their 2001 census, right?
Mhm.
78% of the Ukraine are ethnic Ukrainians, right?
Okay.
17.3% are Russians, and then various other groups make up the rest of the population. So it's like 0.3% Jewish. They've got a small Korean community there and
Mhm.
other
Mhm.
nations. Now, I want you to contrast this with something else from the 2001 census.
Okay.
67.5% state that Ukrainian is their national language, and 29.6 say that Russian is their native tongue. Okay? So you have to understand that
This is problematic.
this is going to become problematic.
Going to be problematic. You can already see that it's going to be problematic,
Right? So,
especially if you live in countries that are made up of mixed populations. You already know what problems are about to occur.
so what happened now is that in 2012, there was a law that was passed that said in any local region where 10% of the population or more speak a language, then that language is to be adopted as an official language. So the
Woo!
governments and wherever else that language could be used in official documents or the rest of it.
That's
Okay.
going to create some problems and
Oh
tensions.
no. No, actually, it in many ways, it was a good law to pass because it makes people feel as though they have a place there. The
Yeah.
problem occurs, and for a lot of the Russian-speaking population, where the problem occurred, or one of the problems that occurred was that in 2014, there was a move to repeal this law, and
Ah,
they saw this as a nationalistic move within the movement within the Ukraine, and felt that they were then being marginalized and pushed out.
of
So
course,
where you made
understandable.
space for them,
Mhm, mhm.
right? Now, the problem is that although there was a push to repeal this law was never signed. The repeal was never actually signed into law.
Oh,
So
no.
this still carried on. What happened um, was it 2019? Maybe in 2019 that the Supreme Court over there found the law that made space for these languages was unconstitutional.
Oh.
Because the Ukrainian constitution says that Ukraine must be language that is okay. So you could have amended the constitution, you could have done but whatever. But the problem
You
is,
could have brought it in as a second language, like, we
problem
have
is,
in other
yes,
countries.
the issue is that that's neither here nor there.
No, it's the feeling of marginalization that's
Right?
gonna be
You
problematic.
have the feeling of marginalization, but this was declared unconstitutional in 2019, and Russia invaded Crimea in 2014.
Yep.
Right? So this law was never repealed. That space, it was still technically legal
Mhm.
where the laws or this law was still on the book. So where 10% of the population or more spoke a language that was to be respected as an official language in that local area,
Yeah, yeah,
right? So you can see there's going to be discontent within these
yeah,
people.
yeah.
And also people living, so you speak Russian, you live near the border of
Mhm,
Russia, you're gonna
mhm.
have family, everybody's gonna have family on
But
side. So where
mhm,
are your ties? You know,
mhm,
and
mhm.
especially the way the USSR was set up and all the rest of
Mhm.
that. You're gonna have family there. So this was always going to create issues.
Mm.
Having said that, it's not justification for invasion of a nation.
No, I don't think
And
anything is like anyway.
so this is where the problem occurs, right? Um, and I think so we need to go back to the Budapest Memorandum and the approach towards this because the
Mm,
problems come out, or some of the problems come out on an international stage, and that is after seeing what has happened in Ukraine.
mm.
Tell me why countries that Western nations don't want to have nuclear powers would stop their nuclear power programs, their nuclear weapon development programs.
Not gonna happen. Not
Because
gonna
you
happen. There's
say
no trust.
right. So
There's no trust.
you're setting a
A
dangerous
precedent.
precedent.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Give up your nuclear power, we'll protect you. Oh no, someone with a nuclear power invaded you. Ugh. Dunno, not much we can do. This was political. Hold on, wait, what? Y'all said you were gonna do something. Oh, well, did we though? This was a political agreement. Political agreements are not legally binding. I mean, you can see that this is gonna have ramifications beyond the Ukraine and to some really difficult
Mhm.
things that we've had happen in the last 10 years with these contracts of trying to de-arm people and denuclearize people. Is that a word? Anyway, it's my word for today.
Right. So you have that. The other thing is that Putin's approach that out of a revolution, two new states were created is problematic. And I think he needs to look at the problems for himself in that you have uprisings in Russia all the time. Does the US then just say, well, you know what? Out of that revolution or uprising, a new state was created. Therefore,
Yeah,
we're going to recognize that and we're going to arm them.
yeah, precisely. Like, what is that? I mean, that's just bizarre. You can just be like, and even if the country themselves come at a peaceable agreement where they separate, you agreed it wasn't your business.
Yep.
You agreed that however that country decided to set itself up and separate its political ways of being, that it was the land border meant that what happens within this land border is not your business. You
Yep.
don't get the right to come in and mess with the people's country. Whatever that country is within the land border makes no difference to you. You are not supposed to come in and mess with that country. So for me, I think there are so many failings. I mean, we knew there were failings. Anyone who's been listening to what's been going on knows there's international failings happening. But this is really deep because it's from the inception of the Ukraine that you're having these problems. Like, you signed a document, you don't recognize the document, and then you just willy-nilly do what you want. And at no point is someone saying, okay, we need to hold these documents as legally binding so that we can keep our face and respect within the country. Like, you just get to make up your own rules as you go along. I really just, how is this? I feel sorry. I feel sorry for Ukrainian people, man. I can't. You know, I can understand why Zelensky is making all the statements that he is. That he's standing up so passionately for his people, for against the Western countries who are not doing anything. I can understand because you lied.
Yep.
You've lied on every single level of possible lie you can give, and you put your name on the lie. You signed the dotted line and put your name on the lie. And for every other country who's in the position to even want to consider, you know, because nuclear weapons are not good, to say, oh, we're going to take that down and out of our country, it behoves them to look at now Ukraine and go,
Listen, if I had a nuclear, if I was the leader of a country and I had a nuclear weapon, you best believe I ain't giving that sucker up.
And I'm also not making an agreement with Russia. Let's all be clear about this, because Russia from the get-go was just making up rules as well. So it's not just the Western countries, but it's also Russia. They were all doing exactly what they wanted to do. So for all those countries who are making their alliances with Russia, you next. Are they gonna come in and tell you that your country's not your own? Like,
here's the thing. I don't know if you remember, as soon as the Russian invasion began, well, first of all, anybody with two eyes and half a brain cell could tell you, why are you listening to Putin? You know he's going to invade the Ukraine. This has been building for months, right? In fact,
he's
no,
done it before. He annexed a bit.
This has been building for years. Right? From the moment he annexed Crimea and you did nothing, you gave him the green light to invade the Ukraine. Now, when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, was it last Tuesday? Right? Yeah. What was it I said to you on Tuesday?
I remember what I had for dinner tonight, but I don't remember what you said to me on Tuesday.
I said to you, the moment that happened, I said, I bet you he goes for where next?
Oh, Finland.
Right? Now,
yes.
What did Putin say? What did Putin say on Friday? He turned his attention and started naming other nations. Because here's the thing, Russia and Finland have history.
A sad, terrible history.
Right? Russia and Finland have a terrible history. So I said to you, he's going to turn his sights towards Finland next. Now, here's the thing. Finland is also another declared neutral country.
He just going for everything. Like, how many? How many countries will fall before we realize you can't just let a madman in an office make up his own rules, not stick to legal precedents around the world? How many times are we going to allow this by saying, well, he sits on the UN Council? Change the damn UN Council. Change the rules of the UN Council, Security Council.
The United Nations isn't fit for purpose. Let's just be real about that. It's
just change the UN Security Council, because clearly you all ain't managing it properly yourself.
Right. So here's the thing. He's going to turn his sights towards Finland, and then we're next. And here's the thing. There's that old adage, history repeats itself.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen this behavior before. And part of the reasons the United Nations was formed was because certain nations declared never again. And
Hmm.
those nations themselves are currently the perpetrators and reason as to why this is happening now.
Again. Right. Okay.
Right. And so, yeah, there's a lot of history in this. I don't think Putin is finished.
No.
Um,
Didn't
and
he draw for he's arming up his nuclear weapons? Didn't he draw for that this
they're at the
Sunday?
highest level. They're at the highest level of alert. And here's the thing. Look, this is my view. And look, we're close enough that if anything was to happen, we'd feel it. But I'm like, he said he's going for his nukes. Call his bluff. If he nukes, so be it. Right? The reality is that the world is held to ransom by
By one
nuclear
man
power,
saying, yeah.
right? And if one man says, I'm going to do this, then everybody backs off. And the problem with that is that where does it end?
Where innocent lives are being lost, people's rights are being trampled. He is taking whole swathes of countries. I mean, and with under the threat of, well, I'm going to go for my nukes then. Well, okay, we got nuclear weapons too. What's your point?
Right,
You can't hold the world to ransom.
right.
It's
And part of the reason why I say call his bluff is because if he actually does it, it will lead to a nuclear war, and there will be an immense loss of life. The issue, or for me, when you look at this, that, however, has the potential to destroy the current world order, which is something that I believe is necessary.
this has definitely turned into the dark side for those of you that are watching.
Right. But the reason I say it needs to happen, that they call his bluff on this, and whatever happens, happens out of this, is because it's through the result of a nuclear war that perhaps the world will finally get rid of nuclear
Nuclear
weapons.
weapons. Yeah.
And the problem is that the status quo holds not just this generation to ransom, but future generations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Really.
And so for me, I'm like, look, you just need to get rid of this.
Nuclear weapons need to go. Full
One way
stop.
or another. One way or another, you just need to get rid of them.
Yeah. Nuclear
Right.
weapons do. I mean, it amazes me that countries like Ukraine and other countries have given up their nuclear weapons in the face of the fact that, you know, bigger countries like Russia and the USA have not and are
Yeah.
not. And I
Yeah.
think to myself, well, it's a bit rich you going around telling everyone else to get rid of theirs while you're still sitting on your pile. You know,
Well,
why are yours not going first? I mean, lead by example.
everybody,
Surely
but
Russia and USA lead by example. You get rid of yours, and then the rest of us will do the
well,
same. No, is this not what we're doing?
well, this is where I say if I had a nuclear weapon, I wouldn't get rid of it. Right? Not in today's world, because the U.S. and Russia and the UK, they're decreasing the number. That's their commitment, to decrease the number of nuclear weapons and warheads, not to get rid of them completely. Right? So
Yeah,
here's
that
the
right. There's a
reality.
problem.
When you're trying to tell other nations get rid of yours, but you're only decreasing yours, it's going to get down to the point where, you know what, I have none, and you're the only one in the room with a gun. Now, I'm not a big fan of guns either. The point is, though, if you're standing there with a gun and you
Yeah,
decide to shoot me, there's absolutely nothing I can do.
yeah.
Right?
And the problem is that threat that Russia is exercising now is the threat that will always exist. Don't do as I say, or else.
Right.
That exists. And sadly, within the colonial landscape that we live within, it's not like they haven't done it before. Y'all have gone into countries, stuck your flag in and said, hey, this is my territory now. You're still doing it to this day. It's just that now we have it happening on a different scale in a different place. But this is not unusual. We covered a story not too many weeks ago about the islands where the Britain just went in and said, sorry, people, you're off, shipped them all the people off, took the
Right.
island and gave it to the USA. Hello, it's the same colonialism, just on a smaller scale.
Now, I don't agree with what Putin has done. But the same way I understand the unease of Russian-speaking Ukrainians,
Mm,
I don't believe that Putin is without his own cause or gripes within this.
right.
So, for example, Ukraine, who is meant to be neutral, trying to sign up to NATO,
NATO.
would
It's
allow
problematic.
the US
Yeah,
to, now they haven't,
yeah,
but they were talking about it, would
yeah,
allow the US to essentially park weapons right on Russia's border.
yeah. And that's problematic. Part of this problem was that they were supposed to be neutral.
Right. Now, but the other thing is that you have to look at what's happening in terms of NATO membership and other things, membership to other treaties such as NATO, are essentially modern day empire building,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
It's
Yep.
it's modern, it's a modern form of colonialism.
Yeah.
And so I can understand Putin's unease
Yeah.
with the Ukraine becoming a NATO member.
Yeah.
Does that justify his invasion? No,
No.
because the
No.
reality is Ukraine's declaration as a neutral state was not part of the Budapest Memorandum,
Right. There.
right? They had the right to self-determination, right?
If they self-determine something else, they're allowed to self-determine.
Right. Okay. So
Apparently not if you live next to Russian.
yeah, so um yeah, I can understand the gripes or part of the gripe that Putin would have, but I don't believe it's the reason he invaded Ukraine. I believe it's a pretext.
Well, and this goes back to the point of the amount of resources that the Ukraine has. And
Mhm,
I think that this is where it gets really frightening because we've seen this before. The USA and the UK have gone down into Middle Eastern countries and declared all sorts of things and tried to take over all sorts of land because they would like to use the oil resources, etc. But when it comes to the Ukraine, it's quite spectacular the amount of resources that this country,
mhm,
the landmass, has. And of course, that is something that provides their country with income. You know, it provides them with a standard. Most
mhm.
Ukrainians, as far as it said, the majority of Ukrainians would fall under the term middle class living. They live fairly well off. They live a, you know, a good standard of living there. I'll call it. Well, that was one document I saw. You know, I'm not as I say, Eastern European politics is not my thing, but I think what's really disturbing is that instead of paying for your goods and services, you just thought, there's a cheaper way of doing this. I don't have to pay the people for it. I could just own it myself. And that is the colonial mentality. It is the colonial mentality to say, I could pay you and respect you, and, you know, I could do that. Or colonialism says, I'll just stick my flag in it and take it over and make it mine.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think Ukraine's resources is one of the reasons why there is the potential for Western nations to actually put boots on the ground, right? The amount of gas reserves that they have, the plutonium, I
Mhm.
believe it's tin, and
They
just
have 5% of the world's mineral resources. They have in there the raw metallic materials of manganese, iron, non-metallic stuff. They also have coal. The list is endless of resources, it seems. They produce 30% of the grain for many countries. I mean, it's just,
yeah,
it's a lot.
yeah, you know. So that's one of the reasons why there's potential for boots on the ground. What I do want to speak about, however, is the response to the Ukrainian, um, the invasion of Ukraine, and then I actually want to address the question of does Putin actually care? Right. So,
An easy answer. No, you don't care.
do you want to deal with that one first?
No, no, go ahead. You got your order. Go ahead. We've not got time for me to be sidetracking you. Go,
Okay.
go.
So, The UK and the US, the EU, Japan have all announced financial sanctions on Russian elites and companies. The Russian banks' assets in the UK have been frozen. I believe the US took similar steps. Trade restrictions on high-tech technology. Uh, Russian banks and a number of Russian banks and the Russian state bank cannot borrow, and it was announced that Russia has been banned from SWIFT, which is a high security network that financial institutions use for processing payments.
Mhm.
And it's something like 11,000 financial institutions in
Yeah,
200 different
Swift is
countries.
like the thing. Yeah.
Right. Now that's massive.
But
Uh, well, I was going to say, in conjunction with that, one of the problems that Russia is actually going to face is that two of China's national banks have stopped giving credit notices, letters of credit to Russian
well, that's
banks,
interesting.
Russian state banks.
That's
Uh,
interesting.
and that's one of their closest partners,
Yeah.
right? So that has the ability to exert a lot of pressure that perhaps
Yeah.
Russia did not foresee. Now, there are problems with these sanctions. And the first point to make is that sanctions take time to take effect,
Yes. And they
right?
generally affect the little people first.
Right,
Before they
right,
start affecting anyone near the top, it's the common person living their life, trying to survive under the regime that is going to feel the pinch long before those in power do.
right. The other thing is that, or the problem with sanctions that they take time, is that it creates another problem in that by the time the sanctions really start to take effect, Russia could have taken control of the Ukraine
Yeah.
and then they become moot,
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
right? Um, when the UK
Also introduced no-fly zones, haven't they? So now Russia isn't allowed to fly over the whole of Europe and things like that.
It's pretty much the Western world that Russian planes are not allowed in their airspace.
Both anymore, yeah.
Um, the sanctions that have been applied to a lot of Russian billionaires, et cetera, the UK, when they announced them, I believe the US is the same, and all the other major countries are the same, have not applied sanctions against Putin directly. Right? Now
Yeah.
the argument for this is that if you do that, it sets a precedent and one you might not want to set, but also if you want to continue diplomatic negotiations, you need to still be able to engage with these people.
Can I call like pot calling kettle black at this moment? Because didn't they do this to a number of African leaders when they didn't like what they were doing? They sanctioned the leader themselves. What do you mean you don't want to set a precedent? The precedent's already set. That horse is bolted. What are you talking about?
How many of them were nuclear powers? Right? This is one of the things that you have to bear in mind. They're saying if we want to discuss, we need to keep this avenue open for diplomatic.
If you don't want to discuss, he ran into the people country. He ain't talking to you. He was stalling all that time, supposedly having conversations. Look, they're lying. And then the next day he went run into the people them country. He not talking to you.
No,
He's
and this
lying.
I agree with you. And this is
What do
part
you
of the
mean you don't want
issue.
to set a precedent? The precedent's been set. Deal with it.
And as I said,
Right.
so they talk about this being a last resort to sanction a head of state. I'm like, the dude don't care,
Yeah, listening to you.
right? When you set the sanctions in 2014, and
Mhm.
he's in violation of how many UN Security Council resolutions that he shouldn't be there, right? Once again, the West has no right to point fingers at Russia because you've got Israel doing the same thing, and the US has been protecting them and vetoing UN Security Council resolutions for decades, right? So, all this finger pointing,
Not
you know,
helping.
is
Either
not
enforce
helping.
the things or don't enforce them. That's what you're gonna have to do. At this point, you'll need to just start enforcing them or not enforcing them because you're just making mockery of everybody who's putting effort in on the ground to get that job done, to get these things in for like oh, this thing upsets me. Go ahead. Go ahead.
The EU,
Mhm.
in all its sanctions it announced, never placed sanctions on fuel, on gas and oil coming out of Russia, and they're still buying it. So where you're applying
You're not serious.
sanctions,
You're not serious.
right?
You could just
So
go buy your oil from Nigeria. What's wrong with you? You're not serious.
where you're applying your sanctions and saying we're going to hurt you here, Russia will just be like, okay, well, we increase the price of gas and oil. Not a problem. We'll just make up that money in other ways. So it's
And
problematic.
you're making your own people suffer then, because that's really what's happening. The short-term suffering of saying, all right, country, we're gonna have to battle down, put our money where our mouth is, we're gonna not buy oil from Russia. This is gonna short-term affect you. Long-term, you're gonna affect your people because he gonna put up those prices and literally hold your people over a barrel because he's just driving up the price. Like, are you insane?
Right?
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Speak
So yeah,
selling out
Russia,
their own people.
yeah. So Russia has been preparing for this, and this is one of the things that I don't think people have been mindful of, is that Russia has been preparing for this since 2014. They've been preparing for sanctions, right? So their national bank is sitting on hundreds of billions in foreign currency reserves.
You see that? You see that right there? You see that?
Because Putin's been playing the long game, right?
He's been trying to take over the world.
And when you have, you know, look, I'll speak on that in a second. So with this, Russia has tried to implement its own system for when it was kicked out of SWIFT. So it has its own system in the background. China has the same system. I forgot what they're called. The China one is called CIS, and I can't remember what the Russian one's called. So although they've been kicked out of SWIFT, they still have access to some financial transactions because they've been creating their own network for this. Um, you know, yeah. So you then have
You're finishing straight. You can do it.
imbeciles like Trump. I was trying to choose my words wisely.
Oh Lord, help
You
us.
then have imbeciles like Trump that come out and he's like he's praised Putin for what he's done, and he's made the claim that under Bush, Russia invaded someone. Under Obama, Russia invaded someone, but whilst under his presidency, Russia didn't invade anyone. But they didn't have to. They had control of the U.S. through you. I'm like, they they successfully, peacefully took over your country. They installed someone who was their
They
puppet,
installed a puppet.
right? So, I'm like, yeah. So any response that say the US wanted to do has already been undermined. As I said, Putin has been playing the long game, and
Mhm.
it takes a while for a new administration to catch up, especially when you look at the damage that Trump has done to the US intelligence community,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, under
Uh,
Trump, he had a free reign.
yeah, so there's that. Also, I just want to point out the fact that all these Western nations and nuclear powers are bullies, right? Because when, and we're going to go back to the first Iraq war, when Iraq annexed part of Kuwait, and this similar arguments that Hussein gave was that historically the part of Kuwait he annexed had been Iraqi territory,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
What did they do? They said, no, 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 no. right? They went in,
All guns blazing.
right? And they wrecked the country, right? When you look at what happened in Syria and where they're dropping drone strikes are happening left, right, and center, and they're bombing the people back into the Stone Age, destroying the infrastructure,
Destroying the people's homes,
right?
roads, city, everything gone.
But now you have somebody that if you attack could bloody your nose, you don't want to get in the fight.
Yep.
What happened to all this talk about freedom and democracy?
So
And
you're
we're
bringing
going into this
democracy
country.
and
We're going into this country to give them democracy. We're going into this country to give them freedom. Well, why aren't you going into this country now and giving them freedom and democracy?
they're crying out for it. They're requesting it. They sure as hell were relying on it. They had a contract with you that you do it. Like, I mean, more than any of the countries we met before, they actually have a reason to call on your behind to go in there and do that. You're not doing it? Oh, just
Right?
interesting that,
So
right?
I think we need to talk about
Yeah.
the cowardice and the duplicity
Yeah.
of Western nations and how they're acting towards Ukraine, and call out how they're acting in other nations.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely.
Right. So, because I'm mindful of the time, we've gone over an hour. I'm just going to ponder the question or put forward the question: does Putin actually care
Not
about
a
the
rat's
sanctions?
bottom.
No. The
No.
simple answer to that is no, and the sanctions will have no direct effect on what he does. And my reasons for this are that part of what he is doing is ideologically driven.
Yeah.
So he has spoken about the fact that one of the worst things to happen to the geopolitical landscape was the fall and collapse of the USSR,
Mm, mm.
right? So you have to understand that this is politically driven.
Yeah.
So,
It's
one,
ideologically driven.
yeah, ideologically driven, sorry. So, one, when you put financial sanctions in place, you have to understand financial gain isn't necessarily his motivating
No.
factor in this.
No, that's true. That's true. That's true.
So, one, you're not putting sanctions against him personally, so you're not hurting him financially anyway. But two, he is ideologically driven.
Mhm.
And so, okay, he loses money, he loses money. Those around him lose money, they lose money. Oh well, what
In the long game, he's banking on being stronger and bigger.
right? And that is what is his driving factor, power,
Mm. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think we need to just acknowledge that the West has indulged Putin, who has carried on like a mad dog
Mm.
for decades now.
Mhm.
And they have shown him time and time again that they do not have the desire or willingness to respond to his aggressions.
Yeah.
And it's not like they haven't given cause for this, right? And I'm just going to give you a few reasons why different countries have legitimate political gripes and reasons to actually go to war with him and have had so for years. And
Okay.
that is the number of political assassinations Russia has carried out on foreign soil.
Okay, then. Yes, of
And
course.
I'm just going to give you a few of the ones that have happened while Putin has been in charge. So, in the UK, you have the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in
Mhm.
2018, right?
Mhm.
And it's not just the fact that these people were assassinated on foreign soil. They used a nerve agent. So Russia took a chemical weapon into your country and used it.
And two people in your country, and it had an effect wider than that because wasn't it
Yes, on the
it affect
community. It,
on the
yeah,
community? That's right.
right. Okay. So you then have Ruslan Galeyev. I'm probably butchering the name, but he was the deputy prime minister of Chechnya, who was assassinated by Russian
Yes,
forces in
yes, of
2004,
course.
right? So you have Alexander Litvinenko
Mm-hmm.
in 2006. He was
Yeah.
assassinated by Russian forces in the UK. And what did they use then?
Wasn't it a chemical agent as well? No, oh, he went bald. He died. Radiation poisoning. It
Yeah,
was. Thank you.
they used polonium. So they bought they bought
Nuclear.
radioactive material
Yeah.
into your country and used it to kill people, right? You then have Maxim Shapoval. So he is a colonel in the Ukrainian security forces, and he was killed with a car bomb in Kiev in 2017.
Oh yes, that's right. Goodness, I forgot about that. Jeez, man.
And the most recent one that they can tie to Russian forces is the assassination of Zelim Khan Kangoshvili, who was a Western intelligence agent, and he was assassinated in 2019 in Berlin. Right? And this is just a few. There's a long list of
There's a
Russians.
long list of people. These are the ones that made our news and we would stand out and remember actually, but there are lots more.
Right?
We could
And
talk about.
these have occurred on foreign soil.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right? So you have enough countries that have reasonable grounds to go to
Mm-hmm.
war with Russia and
Yeah.
don't. So my
Yeah.
question is, when you look at the fact that Russia are killing people all over the world, right? You went into Afghanistan for one man.
This dude be murdering people left, right, and center. You ain't doing nothing about him.
Right. So, does he care? No. The man is a mad dog who is going around the world
Assassinating
causing
people.
chaos and carnage.
Yep.
And just y'all are letting him run about.
Yeah. And no one says anything.
Nope.
Or they put in place some sanctions, and he's still a permanent member of the UN Security. I mean, the ridiculousness of that statement. He's a permanent member of the UN Security Council. No, y'all need to overhaul that UN Security Council because clearly it's not working.
Look, I've said it before and I'll say it again. The United Nations is not fit for purpose, right? But also, this is another reason why I say to you, I do not believe in nations.
You know, we're going to, have we done that yet? Have we done the dark side of nations? Clearly we need to do the dark side of nations, but I think for now you've given us an adequate historical overview of the challenges that we're facing. I think it's good and it's educational, but I think it's great to have it all brought back to the forefront of your mind because it does seem that our memories are short-lived, you know? It's like we forget so quickly the wickedness that is done around the world. And when this happens, everyone's aghast, like, oh, how could they do this? And it's like, well, this has been building for decades and the rules have been broken for decades.
Well,
You know,
if you remember back in 2014, I told you he wasn't going to stop at just Crimea.
no, I mean, everyone knew he wasn't. Once he had annexed Crimea, we all knew this was the writing was on the wall because he annexed it and he got away with it. You know, there are no ramifications for taking a whole section of someone else's country. That there should be ramifications for taking a section of someone else's country. There should just, you should just not do that. That's something we just should not do. I think it's really, I think it's just, it's really shameful. And I think unfortunately, particularly so if I take this now and apply this conversation to Christian circles, I think one of the things that's been really disturbing is that you have two fractions of Christianity, not Christians per se, but two fractions of Christianity. One that is almost excited that the end is nigh, that Jesus is coming. And so this for them is, a big coup on a list of things that are doomsday, end of times kind of mentalities. But then you have this whole other section this fraction of Christianity which has decided that Russia is doing the right thing, and it frightens me how easily these evil intentions get to the heart of supposed Christians.
Right.
That
Okay.
really is
So
disturbing.
here's the thing. Here's the thing. When you say about the faction of Christianity that believes Russia is doing the right thing, you're pretty much talking about evangelical Christians coming out of the US, who that it's a large part of Donald Trump's base,
The Trumpists.
the Trumpists, right? Here's the thing these idiots do not recognize. Putin is currently going after parts of or countries that were formerly parts of the USSR. Guess what, people? Alaska was formerly part of Russia. So what happens when he turns his sights towards Alaska? You're all just going to say, all right, we
Oh,
wash our
well,
hands.
we're down to what is it? They're at 52. They're at 51 states again.
No, well, they're 51.
51, back down to 50. Sorry, my apologies.
No,
But yeah, what I think is disturbing is that, so frequently what people are not seeing, and that I think is heartbreaking. The amount of people I know within my circle who are Ukrainian and who their stories are just heartbreaking, trying to get family members out. Of course, the Ukrainian government have a national service, so none of the men are allowed to leave. So men are having to kiss goodbye to their children, their wives. There are mothers who are not leaving without their sons, so they're staying behind to ensure that their sons are looked after at this time. So you've got elderly populations who are staying alongside their children to ensure that their sons have somebody there for them in a point. And I in an adjacent group that I'm in, one of the women there was just sharing her heartbreak because her mum is not leaving her son, her brother. So the woman was sharing her brother has to stay because it's national service, and her mum said somebody needs to stay and look after her son, so she's not leaving. But of course they kissed the whole family goodbye and got them out as quickly as they can. And of course, all power to the organizations that are moving people as quickly as they are, refugees through Poland, through Germany. People are coming to here. And also to acknowledge that the UK revoked refugee status applications for Ukrainians. Amazing. That just we support you, but we're not going to take refugees from your country.
Listen,
Deep breath. I think it's really sad that at the end of all of this, while these political mites bully and gun down and roll through with tanks, etc., there are families who are dying. There are people who are suffering. There are students who are stranded. There are people living in universities. They've had to leave their homes and all huddle together on university campuses where they have become places of refuge for people in the country. I mean, as much as we've talked about the political toll that this takes, the human cost, the loss of life has only just begun. And unfortunately, as we go into this new week, the news every hour was just getting worse for what is happening. And there are families who are really suffering. And, there are lots of organizations that are helping on the ground. And we encourage you to look at those organizations who are proven to give most of the resources to the people and not to their mechanisms. And there's a lot of those on the ground. ADRA being one of them, the Adventist Development Relief Agency. Who are on the ground trying to work as hard as they can to help the people as this crisis unfolds in the Ukraine.
Yeah, look, it's the human cost that really bothers me in all of this.
Yeah.
And historically, Russian invasions of countries have not been kind to the civilian population.
Nope.
And for me, as I said, it's that human cost and actually the sense of coming from a Western nation and that promised protection to these people, and it's failing to deliver
Yep.
what it assured them it would do.
Mhm.
Um, that is really bothering me. And you see, in regards to, I'm going to speak about the UK specifically here in this. What you see in regards to like Syrian refugees, um, is why don't they stay and fight for their country?
A country you bombed within an inch of its life.
But you
That's
have Ukrainians staying and fighting for their
fighting in our
country,
country.
and the ones that don't, or the women and children that are allowed out, or the elderly that are allowed out, you don't even want to provide safe passage for refugees.
No,
That says to me
turns my stomach.
that your your position towards Syrian refugees and people from other countries was never, or your concern was never
Yep,
that they weren't fighting for their country.
yep,
It's just that you are xenophobic and racist, and that is the bottom line.
bottom line. Yeah,
So my heart goes out to Ukrainians, and
yeah,
I have to be honest that Finland is in my thoughts, Poland is in my thoughts,
yeah.
because I honestly believe that
Belarus.
well, Belarus is actually closely tied and affiliated to Russia, so I doubt Belarus is going to be under any problems. They will probably form closer ties with Russia.
That
Um,
puts the people under pressure, and that's the point. It even, my heart even goes out to, because we have Russian church members as well who are just broken over this because it's not their will that's being done. And that's something to be said. The Russian people themselves are protesting in the streets of their own country to end this, and they're putting their lives on the line to stand up to Putin, and yet still we can't get the UK and the USA to honor an agreement that you said you would do, when the people themselves are having to stand up to their own government. And we know this government is very capable of killing its own people without batting an eyelash. So, I think my heart goes out to the people that are caught in this conflict. It's and literally caught in it. They didn't ask for this. They didn't request this. It's not at their request that this is happening. And there are, people across the globe. And I think that's the difficult part of the conversation, particularly when you know that there is Russian loss of life of people who are protesting against their own government and saying, we don't want you to do this. This is not what we want. And you are doing it, and they will lose their lives too in the process of this. And that's hard to realize that your governments, the governments that we're a party to, are just going, "Eh."
yeah, well, I think you just have to realize that this is where you see that these people are more ethical, have more morals, more conviction, and more courage than many leaders.
Yeah,
You know, and look, as I said, I don't want to take attention away from the subject, so I'm not going to speak on Boris Johnson. Um, as I
yeah, let's
said,
take a voice.
my thoughts are with the people in Ukraine,
Yeah,
and my concerns are for the Polish and Finnish next.
yeah, of course. And I can imagine, yeah, yeah. Well, it's been a hard subject. It is going to be a hard week. It is hard times. There isn't anything we can say that will make the dark side any easier today. But we do wish you a peaceful evening or day wherever you may be. And we will be back next Sunday, the usual time, all things being equal, to tackle another difficult subject, I'm sure. So we look forward to seeing you on the dark side, Sunday, 9 p.m. Central European time. Please like and subscribe, share with your friends.
Yeah, I would say to anyone who is watching this, look, please, most people don't know about the geopolitical, historical
Yeah,
uh, aspects of what's going on. Look, share this video so that people do become aware and have some knowledge of what's happening
yeah,
and why it is such a travesty that Western nations are turning their back on Ukraine right now.
yeah. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Storm. We're going to play us out and then we will see you all next week. Good night.